Well, in general, all of my work has to do with how we, as a culture, use, make, share images. What I actually do in a lot of ways is similar to a documentary practice, but whereas a documentary practice might be working on the street, looking for specific subjects and engaging with those subjects and trying to pull something out of that subject to show the world, I do basically the same thing on the web. I frame issues and I look for the things that I think will support those issues, and I then extract visual information from those contexts that I find on the web that give me the information that I'm looking for. The internet is, to me, an incredible archive, and it is parallel to photography on a certain level in that photography from its inception has been, it's multiple reasons why individuals take photographs, but all the photographs together become an archive of humanity on a certain level. And in that sense, they are kind of an index of who we are and a portrait of who we are. The mirrors was one of the simplest and most economical projects that I've made. Actually, that project came out of an experience I had where my bathroom mirror had broken and I was too busy and I didn't replace it, and every time I went to wash my hands, I'd look up and I disappeared. And I had this really profound experience of disappearance. And then looking through home improvement catalogs, because this work started in 2001, or before people were actually using the web. I started to look through these home improvement catalogs and realized that there were mirrors in them with no reflections of people, obviously. They're in these kind of idealized room setups, but what was being reflected in these mirrors were the objects that you're supposed to desire and buy. So I scanned them at really high resolution and printed them to the scale of the original mirror that is being sold in the catalog, and skewed them face forward so that they would sit on them. So they're basically sculptures. They're sculptures of mirrors. I face forward mounted them to non-glare plexi. So when you walk up to one, you have that same sort of profound experience of being missing, of not being there, of erasure, but in your place are these objects that you're supposed to desire and want, like beautiful bouquets of flowers, a soft bed. The mirror is kind of an interesting strategy for bringing the viewer into the space of the photograph or the painting, like in Manet's painting of the bar, I forget the name of the painting, or Brassai's photographs of the Paris cafes, where you had the mirrors, which really basically reflected what would be behind you if you were in that space. So a lot of my work, in fact, all of my work, I would say, has to do with the erasure of the subject, which is the viewer or the person who's being addressed in the photograph. I'm really searching for really small details that tell us something about who we are, often reveal some kind of anxiety around something. In the Honeymoon Suite series, it's looking through the honeymoon suite at the horizon that is like ridiculously candy colored. And I thought I would take the stance of Hiroshi Sugimoto and travel the world through the honeymoon resort brochures, looking for these kind of beautiful the equilibrium between the sea and the sky, but told through these ridiculous colors. And I loved the idea of a horizon being the symbol for the honeymooners, because you can never get to the horizon. So it sort of builds into that, like this impossibility of perfect love. In 2006, I went on to Flickr. At that point, I was thinking about, well, what is the most photographed image in the world that will tell me something about how we think about photography as a culture? So what was the most tagged photograph in the world? And at that time, sunset was. And the thing about my work is that I can't really spend the amount of time that I spend making it, because I collected 33,000 images of, 3,000 images of these suns. Unless there's something deeper there than just simply the collection of something that there are so many of. And I really worked with these, I looked at these sunset pictures for so long before I realized, oh my God, there's one sun in the world. And here it's existing. Like the first search I did, there were 54,000 images of sunsets, and all of them had a singular sun in them. And altogether, you just see all of these suns, and the multiplicity of this floored me, thinking about the fact that the sun, is out there in the infinite universe. It's warm, it's hot, there's only one, we rely on it, it makes us happy, it gives us vitamin D, it's like enlightenment. And there it is, existed in this kind of atomized way on the web, which is electronic, and the light that comes from the screen when you see it is blue, and so that conversion or transcription of the sun into that space was fascinating. So that's when I realized, after 2 months of really sort of thinking about this, that it's not about the sunset picture, it's about the singularity of the sun expressed in so many multiple versions. So that the logic of that had me crop just the suns from these bigger pictures. And one of the things that I wanted to do was take out any kind of subjectivity. So there are no references to trees or ground or any person in those, is just the sun. And realizing that, I can't just have 12 of them. If I'm going to really make this statement about the collectivity of that practice of photographing the sunset and sharing it on the internet, it had to be hundreds and hundreds. I had a lot of responses to this work, and sometimes people are angry that I've used someone's sunset picture without asking permission. And what's fascinating to me about that is that this particular claim of authorship or wanting to own his or her own photograph or image of a sunset is to actually completely deny that idea of looking at it with everybody else. And there's something quite beautiful about that. People often think that if you're doing something that everybody else is doing, it's not a good thing. We do millions of things like that. Religion is basically like that. If you light a candle when everybody does, or you go to church when everybody does. Experiencing and enjoying a sunset is what everybody does. So to claim a kind of individual authorship in that context is to completely deny the beauty of that ritual experience. For me, a book is a specialized architectural space. It's not just a vehicle to put information in. And so I try to treat the book as a kind of space in which work can be installed. So the chronology of this book goes from this kind of the idea of optimism with the suns through domestic spaces, through the sort of breakdown of those domestic spaces, to this really dark kind of the objects that we make that become obsolescent and nobody wants anymore. Some of the work in the book are just simply collections of things that I found, and by virtue of the fact that there can be a collection of that, like the remote controls, which I call universal remotes, because I like this idea of universality and remoteness, which seem to symbolize the web. There's a whole section of broken LCD TV screens, which is fascinating in its own right, just that a seller on eBay is trying to sell a television for parts, and they'll turn the TV on and the screen is messed up. But the light is coming through, and I'm really fascinated by this kind of in front of and behind that screen, that threshold that is the surface on which we get all our information. And that surface is often completely invisible to us until something goes wrong. Sort of like the body. We don't think about the body until something goes wrong, and then we're really aware of it. So I found all these broken LCD TVs for sale on eBay where the light is still able to come through, and fascinated by the fact that they kind of look like modernist paintings. They have this kind of beautiful abstract formalism. And ironically, it's modernism that actually produced the television on a certain level, and the failure of the kind of promise of that modernism. Here we have all these landfills with televisions nobody wants anymore, leaching poison into the earth. I took just the screens from those and made them into kind of painting like they're really beautiful. Books as Furniture is a chapter from a book by Nicholson Baker, which talks about books he finds in a catalog, and he tries to make up this whole story about who's reading what. So I actually just inserted that whole entire chapter into my book around the works that I had been making around books. So that was actually relative to embarrassing books, which is what I called them. Because actually you'll notice if you start looking or are aware of it, that a lot of advertisers and a lot of consumer websites, as decoration, they will put, you know, like a great big shelf of books, but all turned the other way, or in the photographs you have these. Actually, I was just in Gallery Lafayette, and there's like a little display with all these books turned the other way as a pedestal for, you know. It's absurd, and what's absurd about it to me actually is that, like, you know, I always like to project a kind of anthropomorphic story onto things that you know, so it's like, what, did the book turn itself around because it was afraid to, it was embarrassed by its own owner? Or like, what does it mean to empty the information of a book out like that, like just using it as a prop? So to empty out the book by turning it around like that and not, you know, just like completely erasing history, erasing story, erasing narrative, erasing, you know, was fascinating to me. I actually was thinking about the idea of the screen and artificial light, and also noticing that there are a lot of mountains, pictures of mountains, photographs of mountains everywhere, and I had this idea that, like, the more photographers think there's a crisis and the more unstable they feel as photographers because of this, the more photographs of mountains appear in the world, because the mountain is the most stable object. I did a whole research on the mountain as a stable object and found like 300 mountain brands, you know, brands that have mountains as their logos that imply this kind of stability. And so when Aperture asked me to do this project, I decided to pick the Masters of Photography series that they had and look for mountains. I downloaded all the camera apps that I could on my iPhone, because the iPhone to me is the opposite of a stable photographic device. It changes constantly, there's updates, and all these iPhone apps, they're seductive. Like, you can do these things with them, like put these vignettes or these gradients or light leaks and chemical burns. They have all these different filters. So I rephotographed all the mountains in the Aperture's Masters of Photography series with the camera apps in the iPhone and applied all of, I actually realized halfway through that the most interesting filters were the light leaks and the chemical burns, because they just represent a cultural nostalgia for analog photography, but actually the mistakes of analog photography. And no master photographer would ever allow a light leak or a chemical burn into his or her photograph. So, I applied all these filters onto these mountains, and the result was all these kind of psychedelic, ridiculously disorienting photographs that speak to the distance between the time the images were taken and now, the analog and the digital, the master photographer and me, the distance between the mountain and the subject, and also the scripted photograph. Like, these are all effects that most people using these camera apps don't even understand where they're from. So there's this kind of black box quality. And the other absurdity of the light leak is that there's no way it would ever occur in an iPhone, right? So it's the quintessential opposite device to be able to produce something like that. Often people ask me, where is my subjectivity in the work? Where's my hand in the work? And because I'm so much using other people's images, I think for sure the way I think about these things are specific to how I think about the subjects that I work with and how I recontextualize things and make aggregations that aren't just many of the same thing or many of similar things, but actually become something else altogether. Collecting and curating may be a means to an end, but it's not the end.